everyone. So in this session I want to go over the enzyme kinetics, my apologies, and try to get over with this for once and all. And I appreciate you sticking with me, and let's try to see if we can. Of course we can, but we want to fully grasp the concepts and all the mechanisms at play here with the enzymes. Now, if you remember from the enzyme kinetics, I had these few flashcards left, and I also have a few other documents, and I'm going to use Google perhaps to understand these better. And let's get through this. So here we can see that we have three main inhibitors that we want to compare and contrast. So there's also 5 factors here that we compare the inhibitors with. Where do they bind? Where do they have effect on the Km? What effect do they have on Vmax? So that's 3 already. And do they bind allosterically? And can added substrate overcome inhibition? The last one means that if you add substrate to your solution, and we know that substrates bind to the active side of the enzyme, so does that added substrate overcome the inhibition? Does it predominate the inhibition? Right? Now we have a diagram here for the 3 of them, right? There's also the Lineweaver-Burke plots that we want to know about. It's basically an x-axis and y-axis that we will be comparing the inhibitors with. And also there is Michaelis-Menten curves. So basically the first thing is to know the structural interplay between the inhibitors and their effect on the Km and the Vmax and with the enzyme in general, and also the Lineweaver-Burke plots and the Michaelis-Menten curve. So on this section here, if we can start, let's start from the top. So Vmax, as we remember, let's test ourselves. Vmax is the reaction speed, the maximum reaction speed that the enzyme, and V is the specific speed for that enzyme, right? And Vmax is the maximum reaction speed that can take place. So it's maximum rate of the reaction. And we know that if you add, so there are 2 things that you can do. You can either add more substrates, or you can add more enzymes to the solution. Now, if you add enzymes to the solution, it means that you have more of these agents, you have more of these technologies within the solution. And that means that the more technologies you have, the faster the reaction will be. And when you increase the number of enzymes, more technologies, you are increasing the speed of the reaction, right? You are increasing the whole speed. Imagine 1 car being in the city, it can transfer only 5 passengers, but imagine you have 100 cars now in the city, and with that you can transfer 500 passengers. So when you increase the enzymes, you are actually having an effect on the Vmax, so the Vmax also increases. But the Vmax does not increase with adding more substrates. You do not increase the Vmax with adding more people, more passengers, because you have only one car, right? So I believe that that's totally making sense here, right? And let's see if we actually have talked about this or not. So increasing the substrate concentration does not increase Vmax, but increasing the amount of enzymes does. Perfect. So we have this covered. And there's also the second concept, which is the Km, and that is the amount of the substrate concentration at half of the reaction speed, right? So the amount of substrate needed for the enzyme to work half as fast as it is capable of. And Km is basically a sign for showing the affinity of the enzyme to the substrate. So if you are attaching as a substrate, if you're attaching to the enzyme faster, or actually the other way, if you're an enzyme and you are attaching, you have more affinity to the substrate, you're attaching to the substrate much faster, then that way you're actually having a lower Km, because on the Km plot it goes more to the left. It's much faster, right? So let's look at the plot before anything. So if this curve is going to the left, it means that your half of Vmax, which is your Km, is more to the left, which means that you needed less substrate concentration to achieve the Vmax half of the Vmax, which is Km. So because you had a lower Km, it means that the enzyme did have actually a higher affinity for the substrate, because with less substrate you were able to achieve the same Km, right? So that's the concept. It has there's a reverse relationship between Km and the enzyme affinity to the substrate. Cool. So we have that also covered. Here you can see what I just said. So higher Km equals lower enzyme substrate affinity, and vice versa. Now, then we dive into the concept of inhibition. So there are three main types of inhibition: the competitive, the uncompetitive, and non-competitive. And the way I just memorize the order is a vulgar way, which C, U, N, and N stand for cunt, and the C is competitive, U is uncompetitive, and N is non-competitive. Now, for these three inhibitions, we want to see their effect directly on the Vmax and Km. And I know it's weird, but for uncompetitive, I have realized that unread messages are always reducing, right? It is frustrating. What do I mean? So unread messages, UN, unread. So Vmax and Km are reduced. So unread messages, Vmax and Km are reduced. So we have that covered. However, in order to understand why with uncompetitive Vmax and Km are reduced, we need to know more about the mechanism. We need to know why, how uncompetitive inhibition is different from non-competitive or competitive inhibition, right? Now, for that, we can take a look at the mechanisms here and see if there's any questions left, so that we can ask ChatGPT or find it in Google, right? So for the competitive inhibition, we know that the inhibitor binds at the active site, and the active site is exactly where the substrate sits on the enzyme in order for the reaction to take place, to be faster, right? And if the competitive inhibitor is binding to the active site, it means that there's no more room for the substrate. So this prevents the substrate from binding. What would that actually make you think about? If there's no more room for the substrate, which one is affected, the Vmax or the Km? We know previously from the affinity of the enzyme and the substrate that this is the whole concept of Km. So if the substrate is not able to attach to the active site, this makes us think that, oh shit, so the enzyme does not have the same affinity to the substrate anymore, because it is already full, satiated. It's not hungry anymore. And that must have an effect on the Km, right? So the Km is increased. Okay. So why is it increased? First of all, what does an increase in Km imply? It implies that the affinity of the enzyme and the substrate is decreased. And it totally makes sense, right? Because when the enzyme is satiated, it's not hungry anymore, it's not attracted to the substrate anymore as much as before, at least. So the Km is increased. And should the substrate, the active site being full, affect the Vmax? Well, if it had to affect the Vmax, what would you expect? So if the active site is full, it means that the substrate is on the active site, and the enzymes are getting fuller and fuller with the inhibitors, the competitive inhibitors, instead of the substrate. So we know that Vmax is the number of enzymes that actually increase the pace of the reaction. Again, the analogy with the cars, the more cars you have, the faster your reaction goes, right? It takes place. So the more cars you have, the more passengers being the substrates, the cars can travel, the cars can carry, right? And although the active sites are full, although there are these competitive inhibitors, like see them as fake passengers who are not paying money to the car drivers, to the car industry. Imagine, even though they don't pay and they're fake passengers, still the cars, being the enzymes, are carrying those passengers. Does that change the speed of those cars? Does that change the speed of all those cars traveling? No, hell no. The cars are still going back and forth. So the rate of the reaction is not going to change. And boom, we have this covered. So as simple as that. Competitive inhibition is the inhibitor sitting on the active side instead of the substrate. So there's no more room for the substrate, so the enzyme becomes less attracted to the substrate, therefore less affinity between the enzyme and the substrate, and less affinity between the enzyme and substrate implies a higher Km. It has a reverse relationship, right? And Vmax does not change because we didn't increase or decrease the number of enzymes. So boom, we have that covered. Now back to uncompetitive inhibition. Why does Vmax and why do Vmax and Km decrease? Well, a non-competitive inhibitor binds only to the enzyme substrate complex. Now here there is a bit of difference, a bit of factual differences between this document and the Anki cards here, I believe. So we will fact check everything here, just to be clear on everything. Because here in this graph, we are saying that, okay, so E stands for enzyme, so the competitive inhibitor again, binding to the active side is binding to the enzyme. Sure, that makes sense. So let's say that enzyme equals to the active side, because active side is part of the enzyme. Now the uncompetitive binds to the enzyme substrate complex. Let's go back here. We can see that the substrate is sitting in the enzyme, but the uncompetitive inhibitor is somewhere here. Just look at the structure. So it binds to the enzyme substrate complex only. So both of these documents are actually saying the same thing. So after all, they might be similar. They might be identical actually in information. We'll see. So if the uncompetitive inhibitor is binding to the enzyme substrate complex, how is it reducing Vmax and Km? Let's see. How could both Km and Vmax? So for Vmax, we know that the enzymes should be decreasing in order to decrease the Vmax, right? Instead of having 500 cars, we will have only 100 cars. So the Vmax is increased. Less passengers are being traveled. So the speed of the passengers traveling is decreased. And for the Km, if the Km is reduced, it means that the enzyme has higher affinity for the substrate. And that implies that something has happened which has made the enzyme being more attracted to the substrate. And here we can see that the uncompetitive inhibitor binds only to the enzyme substrate complex. And still, I want to specifically know what is happening here that makes the enzyme more attracted to the substrate, and also it is decreasing the number of enzymes available in the reaction. Let's see if we find anything here. There is the Michaelis-Menten curve, where we are seeing what happens with the uncompetitive inhibitor, but there's still no explanation for that. So we must ask this from ChatGPT or something like that. Okay. What is happening during uncompetitive inhibitor during uncompetitive inhibitor attaching to the enzyme substrate complex that results in the enzyme having less affinity. I'm sorry, when the Km is decreased, it has higher affinity for the substrate, increased Km, and lower rate of reaction, decreased, sorry, I meant decreased Km and decreased V max. So when an uncompetitive inhibitor attaches to the enzyme substrate complex, it binds only to the enzyme substrate complex, not to the free enzyme. This binding process typically occurs at a site distinct from the active site. Here's what happens. Oh, interesting. So we can assume here now that the substrate attaches to the enzyme first, and then the uncompetitive inhibitor attaches to the enzyme substrate complex. The first step is binding specifics. The uncompetitive inhibitor attaches to the enzyme substrate complex, forming an enzyme inhibitor substrate complex. So it's these three being a complex altogether. This complex is different from the typical enzyme substrate complex formed during the normal catalytic process. Second is the conformational changes. So this is what I was expecting, and I've also studied about this before. So the binding of the inhibitor locks the enzyme and substrate in a different conformation compared to the normal enzyme substrate complex. This altered conformation might prevent the release of the product or slow down the catalytic reaction. Interesting. What does it mean by that? The Km, the Michaelis constant. The Km value represents the substrate concentration at which the enzyme works at half its maximum velocity, Vmax or 2. Perfect. In uncompetitive inhibition, the inhibitor binds only to the enzyme substrate complex, which reduces the amount of free enzyme available to form more ES complexes. What did we just read here? In uncompetitive inhibition, the inhibitor binds only to the enzyme substrate complex. It binds only to the enzyme substrate complex, not the enzyme, not the free enzyme, and anything else. So, which that reduces the amount of free enzyme available to form more enzyme substrate complexes. How does it do that? As a result, the apparent affinity of the enzyme for the substrate increases because it takes less substrate to saturate the remaining available active sites on the enzyme, leading to a decrease. So still, we want to get more specific. How does... We should also quote it to be more specific. How does the binding of the inhibitor, specifically uncompetitive inhibitor, to the enzyme substrate complex reduce the amount of free enzyme available to form more ES complexes. As a result, the apparent affinity explain me the is this chemical, like chemistry thing? So biochemical, explain me the biochemical process that takes place here specifically. Let's see. As a result, the apparent affinity of the enzyme for the substrate increases because it takes less substrate to saturate the remaining available active sites on the enzyme. So it takes less substrate to saturate the remaining available active sites. So binding of the uncompetitive inhibitor locks up some enzyme substrate complexes, preventing their conversion to product. As a result, fewer enzyme substrate complexes are converted to product per unit time, lowering the overall rate of reaction, thus decreasing Vmax. Also, how does the uncompetitive inhibitor lock up enzyme substrate complexes to prevent their conversion into products? Okay, let's go. I hope it gives us a good answer. This binding changes the dynamics of the enzymatic reaction by affecting the formation of ES complexes. Binding to ES. When the substrate initially binds to the enzyme, it forms the ES complex where the enzyme and substrate are bound together, ready for the catalytic reaction to occur. The uncompetitive inhibitor recognizes and binds selectively to the ES complex, forming an enzyme. Yeah, we talked about it. EIS complex. This binding site might be distinct from the active site where the substrate binds. The binding locks up that specific enzyme substrate pair. Once the inhibitor binds, the enzyme is no longer free to release the substrate and form more ES complexes. Consequently, the enzyme that's bound to the inhibitor is effectively removed from the pool of available free enzymes, decreasing the number of free enzymes available to bind with additional substrate molecules. This altered conformation may hinder the catalytic activity of the enzyme. The inhibitor essentially traps the enzyme substrate complex in a state where it's unable to proceed with the catalytic reaction to form products. I want more explanation. So let's give it a third try. If not, but explain to me more in detail. This binding might occur at a distinct allosteric site on the enzyme, not necessarily at the active site. The inhibitor binding to the ES complex traps this particular enzyme substrate pair in a unique conformation. This binding event induces allosteric changes in the enzyme structure, potentially stabilizing the conformation of the enzyme that favors inhibitor binding. So the inhibitor binding to the ES complex traps this particular enzyme substrate pair in a unique conformation. So this binding event induces allosteric changes in the enzyme, potentially stabilizing conformation of the enzyme that favors inhibitor binding. As a result, the enzyme that has bound to the inhibitor is essentially locked up in this inhibited state and is no longer able to release the substrate or carry out the catalytic reaction. With this specific ES complex locked, fewer free enzymes are available to form new ES complexes, reducing the overall rate of reaction. The binding of uncompetitive induces conformational changes. These changes might disrupt the catalytic machinery, hindering the conversion of ES complex into products. The altered conformation might block or slow down the transition into products, essentially preventing. Okay. Give me real life example of this. The drug methotrexate in its action on the enzyme DHFR, dihydrofolate reductase. Methotrexate is a medication used in chemotherapy and other conditions like autoimmune diseases. It acts as an uncompetitive inhibitor of dihydrofolate reductase, an enzyme involved in the synthesis of DNA and RNA precursors by catalyzing the conversion of dihydrofolate into tetrahydrofolate. Here's how methotrexate functions as an uncompetitive inhibitor. It binds to the enzyme substrate complex. DHFR binds to its substrate, dihydrofolate, forming the enzyme substrate complex. Methotrexate specifically binds to DHFR dihydrofolate complex, not to the free enzyme or substrate alone, forming an enzyme inhibitor substrate complex, the EIS complex. Methotrexate binding to the DHFR complex locks up that specific enzyme substrate pair. This inhibits the DHFR enzyme from releasing dihydrofolate and forming more ES complexes. So, how does the binding of methotrexate, being the inhibitor, to the DHFR the ES complex lock up that specific enzyme substrate pair? How does it lock it up? We know it's conformational, but how? Like, we want a picture, right? Describe the picture of how methotrexate locks up the enzyme substrate complex of DHFR dihydrofolate. Dihydrofolate binds to the active site, forming the complex. Methotrexate recognizes the complex. Methotrexate specifically binds to a site on DHFR distinct from the active site, but the binding occurs only when the enzyme is already bound to the substrate, dihydrofolate, forming an EIS complex. Methotrexate binding induces conformational changes in the DHFR enzyme substrate complex. These conformational changes stabilize the interaction between DHFR methotrexate dihydrofolate, effectively locking the complex in a specific state, is the EIS complex state a lower energy state because it is more stabilized, because it is more stable or stabilized. The conformational change might alter the active site geometry or the catalytic residues positions, preventing the conversion of dihydrofolate into tetrahydrofolate and disrupting the normal catalytic function of DHFR. So the conformational change, forming up basically the EIS complex, might alter the active site geometry, the shape of the active site, or the catalytic residues positions. What are these? What are these catalytic residues positions? So, preventing the conversion of dihydrofolate into tetrahydrofolate and disrupting it. So, because this conversion is prevented right here, that's where we have the decreasing Vmax, as we can understand, right? Because the reaction is basically kind of stopped. So the rate has stopped. We are no longer converting the substrate into the product. That's the explanation for Vmax. And the Km is decreased, which means there's more affinity between the enzyme and the substrate. And why is that the case? We asked about the Km up here, right? The inhibitor binds only to the enzyme substrate complex, which reduces the amount of free enzyme available. It reduces the free enzyme available to form more enzyme substrate complexes. Because there's less free enzyme available, it means that should also mean that the Vmax is decreasing, right? Or not, maybe. But the free enzyme being less available means that there's less free enzymes attracted to the substrate, which means that the Km should be increasing. However, as a result, the apparent affinity of the enzyme for the substrate increases because it takes less substrate, leading to a decrease in Km. So a decrease in Km means that there's higher affinity. So how does the enzyme has higher affinity to the substrate? Because it takes less substrate to saturate the remaining available active sites on the enzyme. Oh, so Km is about so a higher Km means taking less substrate concentration to bind to the enzyme. So the affinity is high. Let's see. Again, so if there is lower Km here, it means that the enzyme substrate affinity is high. So that is why it takes less substrate to fulfill the enzymes. It takes less food, less km to uh, satiate the enzymes. So what are these residues positions? That was our question. So if it's taking less substrate, the affinity is increased. The affinity is increased because, so this is a cause and effect. So because it takes less substrate to saturate the remaining available active sites, because all those enzymes and substrates have formed complexes, so this is how I think we have to imagine this. If the cars, being the enzymes, are having the passengers inside them, and they just drop them at the destination and come back and do it again, some of those passengers or some of those cars still hold on to the passengers with the help of the uncompetitive inhibitor. So some of those cars return back to the car station. What do you call it? Like, we have the destination and your what's the opposite of destination? The source, the start. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me, but yeah. The port of origin. Yeah, like from the origin. Yeah, there's no word for, like, good word for destination. I don't know why. Yeah, so from the origin. So if the cars are returning back, some of them, they're returning back full, the passengers are still in the car for some stupid reason, then there's less free enzymes available. So if there's less free enzymes available, you need less substrate. So if you need less substrate, that's also an explanation for a lower Vmax, because you have less of those cars, those empty cars available for the reaction to go get faster and faster. So that's why both of your Vmax is decreased and also your Km is decreased, because the affinity is now higher for between the enzymes, the lesser cars available, and the passengers, because there are more passengers rushing in to get on those empty cars, because not all those cars are empty, right? That's why you have a decrease in Km, and that's why, man, it is beautiful. I think we got it. But still, in the biochemical realm, this ChatGPT is not explaining us. ChatGPT is not explaining us why it is exactly the case. So keeps blabbing and blabbing, but not the full scientific thing. So yeah, we found a glitch with ChatGPT, a beautiful one. Can vary depending on the specific interactions between the complex. Generally, when an inhibitor binds the enzyme receptor complex, it can stabilize or destabilize the complex, altering its overall energy. Stabilization, in some cases, the binding of an enzyme complex might lead to a more stabilized. Stabilization can occur through various interactions like hydrogen bonds, hydrophobic interactions, or electrostatic forces between the inhibitor enzyme and substrate. Destabilization complex, altering the arrangement of the enzymes interactions unfavorably and increasing the energy of the complex. Is lower energy state depends on specific interactions involved with which can vary between different enzyme inverted pairs. Catalytic residues are amino acid residues within the active site of enzymes that directly participate in the catalytic reaction. So they are amino acid residues that are actively working at the active site of the enzyme, right? These residues might include amino acids such as serine, histidine, aspartate, glutamate, lysine, cysteine, etc., depending on the enzyme and the nature of the catalytic reaction. Their positions are crucial for facilitating the catalytic reaction by stabilizing transition states, forming temporary intermediates, or providing an environment conducive to the reaction. The positions of these residues are essential for the enzyme's catalytic activity as they play roles in binding substrates, facilitating reactions, and stabilizing intermediates or transition states during the catalytic process. In the case of DHFR, specific catalytic involving amines within the active site that typically interact with the substrate dihydrofolate during the catalytic reduction of dihydrofolate. The exact residues might vary among different enzymes and reactions. Okay, cool, nice. We can later on ask ChatGPT to give us actually a full passage, and specifically, this would be a good prompt for this scenario. Give me a challenging MCAT passage on this topic while and ask me multiple choice questions on the residues interacting at the active site and connect the concepts of enzymes and inhibitors and hydrogen binding with the amino acid residues. Something like that, right? Now, specifically, we can find this in Google. So we understood that it was either the amino acid residues playing at the active site, or there was the catalytic residues, or basically the complex, the EIS complex here. So the conformational change might alter the active site geometry, so the geometry of the active site, or the catalytic residues positions. So there are those catalytic residues positions also this is very connected to the active site geometry in changing its shape, right? But still, at the molecular level, how does uncompetitive inhibitor change the conformation of the enzyme substrate complex? But yeah, we actually got this. We now understand that this this conformational change after when the substrate is binded to the enzyme, So we have the enzyme substrate complex, and then the uncompetitive inhibitor comes and it forms the EIS complex, and this causes a conformational change at the geometry of the active site or some amino acid residues here, and it makes less of the free enzymes available, which results in both Vmax and Km decreasing. Vmax is easier to understand because you have, in the car analogy, you have less empty cars coming back at the origin to speed up the reaction. And for the Km, because you have, again, less free enzymes available, that means that there are more substrates, there's more affinity between the cars and the substrates and the passengers. There's more affinity between the free enzymes and the substrates. So they want to get on the empty cars despite less of them being available, and increasing the reaction speed. So it results into lower Km, which means higher affinity between the enzyme and substrate complex. Boom. We got two of them down. Back to competitive. Why was the Vmax not changing? Because the active sites are are full, and we're not affecting the empty cars being back or not. So imagine fake passengers getting on the cars and going to the destination, but the car comes back empty. So the speed of the reaction is not affected. However, the affinity is affected, and there's less affinity because less of the passengers are getting on the cars when this should actually make us think, okay, there's less passengers, real passengers, who are paying getting to the destination. So shouldn't this affect the Vmax, the rate of the reaction, the whole process happening faster? Well, we should see Vmax as all of these enzymes, all of these cars going back and forth. So it's over a time period, right? And it's kind of on a limitless time horizon. So you should say, okay, if we just do this whole cars, enzymes going back and forth onto infinity, right? What is the maximum reaction? What is the maximum speed that we can have for the reaction? What is the maximum speed that we can travel all these passengers with, right? You can only increase the maximum speed by like modifying the engine, right? Engine of the car, or having more cars, right? I think it's better to think of it as modifying the engine of the car, because if when you are modifying the engine of the car, you are increasing the speed. But however, we can still explain it with having more cars or not. So if you have more cars, more enzymes, then your Vmax increases, right? And if you have less cars, your Vmax decreases. If the competitive inhibitors are sitting at the active site, then yes, the cars are, some of them, full, right? So the affinity of the substrate, with the enzyme is decreased because there are more substrates available to attach to the enzyme, right? There are more passengers, and the affinity of the enzyme becomes less because the fake passengers came. So, but how does it not affect the Vmax? Because all those 500 cars that are all those 500 enzymes that are going back and forth, they they are eventually carrying the passengers, the substrates, and the speed of the reaction is how fast you can turn the substrates into products. So how fast you can carry the passengers from the origin to the destination, right? And how fast you want to do it is, yes, with increasing cars, or if you want to make it faster, you can increase the cars, you can bring in more cars, or you can modify the engine. But yeah, let's ask it from ChatGPT actually. So we can save this somewhere here. You can save it as prompt. But why does competitive inhibitor increase Km and does not affect the Vmax? So they are competing directly with the substrate for binding. Their mode of action affects the kinetics of competitive inhibitors, increase the apparent Km value. Since they compete with the substrate for the active site, higher concentrations of substrate are needed to overcome the inhibition and reach half of the maximum velocity. This increase in Km occurs because the inhibitor effectively reduces the affinity of the enzyme for the substrate. When there is more substrate required to achieve that Km, it reflects a decrease in the enzyme's apparent affinity for the substrate. So, why is there no effect on Vmax? At high substrate concentrations, enough substrate can outcompete the inhibitor for the active site, allowing the enzyme to achieve its maximum velocity. This is because at high substrate concentrations, the enzyme is more likely to encounter and bind substrate molecules before the inhibitor can bind. Vmax remains constant because at saturating substrate concentrations, the enzyme can still achieve its maximum rate of catalysis, regardless of the presence of the inhibitor. So a good question to ask for the Vmax to figure that out, the effect on Vmax, is to ask if I increase my substrate's concentration to maximum, to point of saturation, can I overcome the Vmax speed? Can I, because it's a competition for the active side, then yes, more substrates can sit on the enzyme substrate complex instead of the competitive inhibitor. But for the uncompetitive inhibitor, because the substrate sits on the enzyme complex, because the passengers sit on the car, then no matter how many of them, because actually that would actually make less amount of substrate needed for the reaction to take place, so less Km, so there is high affinity for the substrate, right? But however, the conformational change in the EIS, the EIS causes conformational change in the enzyme inhibitor, enzyme substrate complex, and that will actually reduce the Vmax, decrease the Vmax, because less of the cars are going full. They're coming back full at the origin, but for yeah, that's the best analogy actually. But for the competitive inhibitor, this takes us so long to understand it fully, but it's needed. And for a competitive inhibitor, we understand that the cars go with some fake passengers, but actually if you have more and more substrates, real passengers, they will all get in the cars, and also the cars come back empty, which doesn't affect the Vmax. But Vmax is reduced for the uncompetitive inhibitor. I'll be right back to go for the non-competitive inhibition and finish off with the Lineweaver-Burke plots and the Michaelis-Menten curves. I'll see you back in a second.